The job of property management and the job of a property manager is a pretty crappy job.
But what you come to understand is that the property manager, a good property manager, does more than just collect rent. I actually did some math on what we saved over the course of 5 years of self-management. And on management fees alone, it was close to $45,000. The business model of property management is fundamentally flawed. People either have to get really big in order to make enough profit. All right, welcome back to our special podcast series, The 20-Minute Investor, where we bring you actionable nuggets and insights from our real estate investing journeys in bite-sized 20-minute episodes. I'm Erin. My wife and I built a portfolio of 8 cash-flowing rentals across 3 states while working full-time and raising a young family.
And I'm Nathan. I'm a husband, father, a tech executive who built a portfolio of cash-flowing rentals across 2 states from over 2,000 miles away.
Together, we co-founded the Remote Real Estate Academy, where we coach investors on how to build their own portfolios of cash-flowing rentals from anywhere in the world. All right, this week we are going to dive into mistake number 2 out of our 5-day email course on the biggest mistakes that new remote rental investors face. Mistake number 2 is underestimating property management challenges. So specifically, why investors potentially overlook some of the complexities that come along with managing a rental, especially from afar, and why that oversight can lead to your property going neglected, turning into a money pit of deferred maintenance, and potential issues with tenants. And then, of course, instead of just complaining about problems, we will share our thoughts on how you might avoid this mistake. So one thing I love about this topic that I think Nathan and I are going to have fun with is that we took 2 different paths. We have a lot of parallels in our stories, but management is not one of them for the most part. My wife and I we self-managed our properties even remotely for the majority of the time that we've owned them. It was actually only last year in 2024 that we brought on third-party managers in each of the 3 markets. Now, Nathan, on the other hand, a much smarter person than I am, understood from the get-go that property management is more complex than most people think, and decided to go with a third-party property manager and set up kind of a layered system of oversight. So maybe what we do here is kind of present our base case for why we did what we did. And let's start with the more measured and probably balanced approach of what you did, Nathan.
Well, I don't know that I'm smarter, but I also know that I had constraints in my life that kind of forced me to go down this path. Not only are all of the properties in our rental portfolio thousands of miles away, so I didn't have access to them, but also, and maybe more importantly for us, for myself and my wife, it was really about not sacrificing our family lives or our professional lives. Both my wife and I have full-time jobs that we love. We have 2 young kids that we love. Obviously, we want to be there, be present, spend time together, her and I as well. So we very intentionally were looking at ways and systems and whatever options were available to us to not pick up another job of managing, rental properties, especially because we knew from the get-go, we weren't just buying the one property and, the one and done. We knew we wanted to scale. We knew we wanted to get this to, a number of properties, whatever that, I don't know that there is a final number or goal in mind, but it was more than one. And it was enough that, we could replace over time, either one of our incomes or at the very least provide a better kind of retirement for ourselves. So we knew that, potentially having to manage one would be okay without sacrificing, too much of our, lives. But what about when we have 10, 12, 20? Would that still be the case? So we, from the start, always engaged with, property management because we wanted to delegate as much of that work as we possibly could. And that was by choice and by constraint because we didn't want to sacrifice more time. The other thing as well is when we started thinking about this with my wife is like and I'll be curious to hear what your thoughts are because you've obviously, self-managed some of your properties. But if you think about it, the job of property management and the job of a property manager is a pretty crappy job if you think about it, because they're kind of stuck in between, a rock and a hard place. The rock being the owner investor who wants to squeeze every last, drop of blood they can out of this, rental property so that it performs at its best and it brings as much possible money, as you could possibly get from a rental. You want to be cheap on repairs. You don't want to spend any money, all this stuff. And then the hard place is the tenant, who are on the opposite side. They want a clean place to live. They're going to report issues. They want, timely responses. They want a clean, safe, fixed up property. So they're coming in with the requests, and all these 2 kind of, opposite kind of positions are both going towards the property manager. And we didn't want that additional stress in our lives. So that's why we're delegating and happily paying part of our rental income to someone else, in this case, a property manager, to do that crappy work for us.
Yeah, no, fair. And I think working backwards from your constraints is what we teach, right? When we work with people that come through our program, is be aware of and acknowledge your constraints and then build your business around that. Now, what I'm about to say though is that I did kind of the opposite, mostly out of ignorance when we started. I wasn't part of a mastermind group or community. I didn't take any courses. I didn't know what Bigger Pockets was until after we owned several houses. And the main model that I had to build off of was what I saw my parents do, because my parents are also real estate investors. And they mostly self-manage their portfolio. There's only a small period of time where they had a third-party manager, and that was when they had I think they had 13 rentals total at that time. And so that was mostly a load management type thing. But so honestly, like I didn't really question much. I kind of accepted the default of what I saw them do. And I just assumed that's what everyone did. They self-managed their properties because they lived nearby. Even when they lived far away from some of their properties, they still chose to do that. And it was, their systems were not very sophisticated as far as like using rent collections tools and all that, but they knew their way around how to solve problems with stuff like maintenance. And that's a big difference between them and I, because I am not that person. They're much more handy than I am. So anyway, where I'm going with that though, is that like when we bought our first property, it was actually only 1 mile away. So I always talk about now, we started as the opposite of long distance investors. We started with our property 1 mile away, and now our closest rental is 1,000 miles away. But when it was 1 mile away, I just had that kind of, again, default assumption in my head that if something went wrong, I would just drive down the street and take care of it. But what you come to understand is that the property manager, a good property manager, does more than just collect rent and, send out leases for signatures once a year. There's a lot more that goes into it. And so when you start to think about like, oh, the 8% or the 10% that you're saving on the base rate, it's really a protection. It's almost an insurance policy of how do you protect your asset better. So I actually did some math on, what we saved over the course of 5 years of self-management. And on management fees alone, it was close to, I think it was $45,000, which is a lot of money. But over the course, 8 properties over about 5 years, it's a good chunk. And of course, that was helpful to our bottom line. But I also think about the potential mistakes that we made, or the things that we overlooked, or the lack of ability to provide as informed of oversight as someone who knew that how to take care of a house better than we do. Like there's definitely some deferred maintenance and items that popped up that had we been more proactive or more hands-on or available, we probably could have avoided or at least mitigated some of that. So I do think of property management as also that 8%. Yeah, it sucks to pay that right off the top of your rent every month. But if they're doing their job, they can prevent far more expensive things from happening and coming and biting you. And at the end of the day, when you're running a portfolio, especially of multiple rental properties, you want it to be as predictable as it can be. So like you kind of know when your roof is going to age out or when your appliances are going to age out. Within a few years, like you can prepare for that so that you can set aside the appropriate money and all that. And that's something a good property manager can help you keep a pulse on. So if you're going to self-manage, we would approach it very differently right now than we did when we started, because we didn't have much of anything by way of systems. Like we built out processes as they became necessary. So when we were going to advertise to rent to a tenant, we looked online and figured out what were the free tools and ways that we could advertise that. Okay, we found a site that allows you to upload photos and list it. Great. So we use that. And then, okay, we got tenant applications. We need to screen those and run applications and go through a review process, call references, et cetera. We kind of just made this stuff up as we went. And that was valuable in the sense that there's never a better way to learn than to do. But at the same time, it was very time intensive, and we made a lot of avoidable mistakes as a result. So I think of it as kind of like a university almost. Like we learned a lot of stuff the hard way, but in hindsight, we would have been much better equipped if we had started with like a proven set of systems or SOPs, even if we wanted to self-manage, just using something that someone had already successfully used instead of making stuff up along the way. We would have been much better served. I'll pause there. I definitely have more thoughts, but see if you have anything to add.
Well, yeah, I'm curious. How many do you still self-manage today? Do you do any?
We have 2, and those 2 are the residential assisted living homes that we lease to an operator. So they kind of have a little bit of baked in management in that they have the company that we lease to. So it's a very different relationship than if we were working directly with a family or an individual tenant.
Well, I'm curious because where I was going with that is like, how did this change for you pre and post kids? So I think
Well,
you were self-managing most of your properties before you had kids, right?
yeah. So an important part of my story never to overlook is that, we went from dual income, no kids, to one income, one full-time W-2 income and some partial secondary income and three kids in the course of 3 years. And if you're trying to do the math, we have twins in there. But yeah, I mean, that changed the game. And I've told this story before, but I think it's important to when you talk about the tipping point of what made us make the change. During the birth of all of our children in the hospital, I got these petty, annoying calls from our tenants.
Exactly.
And by the way, before that, I hadn't gotten a call for several months, but it just so happened to perfectly time around when we were in the hospital trying to celebrate this beautiful moment in our lives. And
And I
it
would
was
argue they probably would not have bothered you that much if you had gotten those petty calls before. If you were not in the
exactly,
hospital, you'd be like, "Oh, okay, I have rentals, I deal with it." But it just changes if you're spending time with family. Sorry, I didn't
exactly.
mean to interrupt, but yeah.
No, no. I mean, the cost of those petty moments gets higher the more, kind of value you place on your time around certain areas. So like we talked about you working backwards from your constraints, how you already had kids and how you already knew that you wanted to protect your priorities, your obligation to your employer, your obligation and responsibility to your family. Like those things were non-negotiable and they were always going to come first. So for me, before we had kids, I had a little more flexibility to lean in and I was enjoying it, frankly. Like I enjoyed
Mm.
learning all this stuff. And there was enough cash flow on our properties that, yeah, maybe I was making some mistakes or doing things a little looser, but it was kind of like I was comfortable because we were just enjoying the game. We were finally rental property owners. We're building a portfolio, just like, I don't know, hooked on the journey. But when you have kids, that's a different journey. Growing
So
in your
how
career is a different journey.
yeah.
Every single one of those takes space and time and energy. And at some point, you just have to start calculating like, what is the highest and best use of my time? And I think those particular instances in the hospital combined with starting to really like look backwards and say, is it the best use of my time to do this like minute bookkeeping or like be coordinating calls with vendors or just like hearing random stories, meaningless stories from my tenants that want to just randomly vent in my direction? I don't have enough space in my life for that right now.
How do you think about the $45,000 that you could be saving if you were still property managing
Well, keep in
or
mind
self-managing now?
that was over almost a 5-year
Fair,
period. It's a lot
fair.
of money.
But you
Yeah.
yeah, but you could do the same for the next 5 years, right? And be like, "Hey, we'd be 45,000, plus if I self-managed." How do you think about that today?
So what is that? 9,000 a year? My math's probably horrible. Can I make more than that doing something else? And is that something else, a better use of my time? That's how I think about it at this point. I don't think like the first period of time in which we were creating that savings, I do think that was a good use of my time because it taught me all the skills that I needed and it taught me how to think about property management. And at the time, I don't think I had another lever I could pull where I could make more money than I was saving there without
Mhm,
taking on a full second job of some sort. But
mhm.
now I think I've gained more skills. I've grown in my day job. Like there are different levers I can pull to create more income with less stress. And I'm okay with the idea of somebody who's more professional and better than I am at that job and who happens to
Mhm.
be physically present at those locations doing that job for me because the 45,000 is not that's not a complete stat, right? You have to remember there are definitely some maintenance costs or things that resulted from me not being there and from me not being a professional property manager that certainly drew that number down. Not, it didn't get rid of it. It's still a large savings, but there are things that I bet would have been handled better and cost less money had a different manager been running it.
How do you apply those skills that you learned self-managing today with your property manager?
Well, I have less tolerance for bad property managers. So, in Iowa, we've had quite a journey. We're on our fourth property manager right now. There are periods where we had to self-manage, and had I not learned what that looks like and how to, at a minimum, navigate the different motions. I think I was saying earlier, it's like I think sometimes there's an assumption when you don't know what a property manager does that they just collect a rent and like maybe they post a notice on someone's door every once in a while and then they like re-sign the lease at the end of the year. But it's a good property manager does so much more than that. So I think the skills that I built of creating relationships with different types of vendors, staying really organized on that part, doing all the tax and insurance renewals, like a lot of the portfolio management stuff, like that taught me all the different motions that go into running and managing a rental property. So when I see things slipping through the cracks with our managers that we're paying, I'm a bit more informed on how to call them out about it. I don't think it's
Mhm.
necessary to self-manage in order to know what a manager's supposed to do, but I do think it made me more keenly aware when certain things weren't happening. And I also
Mhm.
think that one lesson we learned, and we've waffled on this a little bit, but the tenants also need, there has to be some sort of check and balance on your property manager. And one instance in Iowa in particular, there was one of these property managers that we no longer work with was giving us the impression and literally telling us that they had done things that they hadn't been doing. And it caused one of our tenants to, the relationship turned very sour. She had no contact with us. And this was the second property manager that had been working with
Mhm.
her. And she ended up getting in touch with us through a Venmo request to my wife. And it was basically this giant note of all the stuff that like wasn't happening and wasn't supposed to happen. And it caused this huge problem, right? And so I realized basically that there was no check and balance on this guy. Like he was telling us stuff was happening and it wasn't happening. And then it became this big story of like the tenant said this and he said that. And so now we kind of have this idea of like we at a minimum will establish some sort of contact with every single tenant. We don't want a day to be involved in the day-to-day, and we make that
Yeah.
very clear. But we at a minimum kind of offer up, this is how you can reach us. Like we want this to be a good, hospitable home environment. We care about the quality of of your experience here. You're in great hands with so and so, but we also would like to know if something is happening that we need to be aware of. So I think the self-management kind of gave us more confidence to be able to be involved in a different way than we would have otherwise. And
Mhm.
now we have like a better relationship with our property managers because I think they understand or they think of us a different way than if we. I think that the standard
Right.
person might want to have their hands completely off and just like call me if the place is burning down. Don't ever talk to me otherwise. That's not really how we are, and I think
Mhm.
that has worked to our advantage so far.
What's the story with the 4 property managers? So, obviously, this one here didn't do stuff they were saying they were doing, but what about the first and third?
Oh goodness. Well, we promised 20-minute episodes, so that might have to belong to another. But
Could be another one then, okay.
in the shortest sense, right? One of them was essentially running a fraudulent business, and they went out of business within 8 weeks of us hiring them. That was the first one. The second one, they were an agent and a property manager, and they ended up
Mhm.
having to choose one. I think the next topic to dig into that will help explain a lot of this is just the business model of property management is fundamentally flawed. People either have to get really big in order to make enough profit, but when they get so big, they have to hire more people, which erodes their profit. Then they have to get bigger. And these companies just end up either getting too big where the service suffers, or they're too small and they don't make enough money and they decide to move on. And so we have had people that are too small and we have had people that are too big. And in both scenarios,
Mhm.
it didn't work out. They weren't doing what they said they were going to do, and they weren't able to deliver on the quality of service that we would want reflected at the homes that we own.
Maybe another episode, you're right. A lot to dig into there.
Yeah, but I think the point we want to drive home here and why we listed this as one of the 5 biggest mistakes that new remote investors make is property management is a little bit more complex than people might think on the surface when they're first getting into real estate. And the decision of whether to self-manage or hire a property manager is one of the biggest ones you'll make that will determine the lifestyle that you have as a rental
Yeah.
property owner, being very conscious of your constraints, like how Nathan was, and being more conscious, like I am now, of the potential cost of the burden of property management is something worth considering and spending some time on before you make a decision.
Mhm.
Hopefully, we gave you 2 good viewpoints on kind of our experience and some of the pros and cons. And hit us up if you have any questions or thoughts. We welcome any comments or emails. We respond to every single one. With that, we will catch you next time. Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you could take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.